Claire stood by the front steps of our new apartment building, her auburn hair catching the autumn sunlight. She looked radiant, full of life and excitement, as if the future itself couldn't wait to unfold for her. For a moment, I forgot about how tired I was from the move. Seeing her like that made everything seem possible. "This is it," she said, flashing that confident, determined smile that had always captivated me. "Our new home." I smiled back, squeezing her hand. "It's perfect." Inside, the apartment was filled with light from the tall windows. The empty rooms echoed with possibilities. Claire wandered from room to room, her eyes sparkling with inspiration. She talked about how she would decorate, where the bookshelves would go, and what colors might work best for the walls. "This place has so much potential," she said, already making plans. I watched her, mesmerized. She had this way of turning anything into something extraordinary. No challenge ever seemed too big for her at the move. Not the unpacking, not life itself. That evening, we shared pizza on the living room floor, surrounded by unopened boxes. She leaned against me, her voice soft but still full of that energy I loved. "I'm so glad we did this," she whispered. "I can't wait to make this place ours." I kissed her hair and smiled. "We will. It's a new beginning." In that moment, I believed it with all my heart. I thought nothing could shake us, that we were unbreakable. How little I understood what was already shifting beneath the surface. A few months passed since we moved into the new apartment. Our home looked perfect. Claire had made it exactly how she envisioned. Life seemed to have settled into a comfortable routine, but something felt off. The evenings we used to spend together became rare. She was often out with friends or working late. One evening, I decided to surprise her. After a long day at work, I bought her favorite flowers lilies and headed to the restaurant where she claimed she'd be having dinner with her colleagues. I wanted to see her smile, remind her that I was still here, that we were still us. As I entered the restaurant, my heart sank. In the far corner, at a cozy, dimly lit table, sat Claire, but not with her friends. Opposite her was a tall, confident man with a smug smile. He leaned in, whispering something into her ear, and she laughed, resting her hand on his in a way she hadn't done with me in a long time. I took a few shaky steps forward, feeling my pulse pounding in my temples. "This is real. This is happening." "Claire," my voice came out louder than I intended, drawing the attention of nearby diners. She flinched, her eyes widening in shock, but instead of guilt or shame, there was something else, irritation, as if I were the one interrupting her evening. The man slowly turned his head toward me, his expression calm, almost bored, like I was some minor inconvenience he didn't care to acknowledge. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger. Claire sighed dramatically, setting down her wine glass with an exaggerated calmness. "Tim, what are you doing here?" she asked, her tone icy, as if I were some lost, annoying stranger. "What am I doing here?" I repeated, stunned by her audacity. "What the hell are you doing here? With him?" A man smirked, leaning back in his chair, completely unfazed. "Relax, man, we're just having dinner." His arrogance ignited something primal in me. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to knock this smug expression off his face. "Dinner," I hissed. "Is that what you call this?" I turned back to Claire, my voice rising. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me?" Claire rolled her eyes as if I were being unreasonable. "Don't make a scene, Tim. It's not as dramatic as you think." "Not as dramatic." My voice cracked. "You're sitting here with him laughing, drinking wine while I'm at home thinking we're still something." She sighed, as if she were so tired of explaining something obvious. "Tim, we haven't been something for a long time." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Cold, detached, final. The restaurant fell suddenly to quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do. My world crumbled, right there between the empty plates and half-finished glasses of wine. I stood frowning in the middle of the restaurant, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath shallow. The sharp smell of wine and food that once made this place feel special now turned my stomach. I couldn't tear my eyes away from Claire and Karl sitting there, so comfortable, so at home with each other. "Ew," I gasped, my voice strained, but it was all I could get out. The anger, the betrayal, it had lodged itself in my throat like a stone. "How long, Claire, how long has this been going on?" Claire didn't respond right away. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something, guilt, regret, but it vanished just as quickly as it came. She sighed. as though she'd been expecting this moment for a while. "Tim, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, though it felt like a slap. "Don't make this any harder than it is to be." "Harder," I repeated, my voice rising now, raw with emotion. "Harder. You're sitting here with him, after everything, and you want me to make it easier." I could feel the burn of anger in my veins, spreading like fire. "What, do you think I'm just supposed to stand here, watch you with him, and pretend everything's fine?" Karl, sitting across from Clare, didn't flinch. He just smiled a smile that was too smug, too sure of himself. He looked at me with a strange kind of pity in his eyes, like I was some fool who had just stumbled into his own defeat. "Tim, man," Karl said, leaning back in his chair, his voice dripping with false calm. "She's been telling you for months, but you weren't listening. I'm just here to give her what she needed, something real, something you couldn't offer her." I felt my hands ball into fists at my sides. This meant this stranger was talking about my wife, as if she were some object he could just claim. I could feel my pulse in my ears, hear the blood rushing through me. "You don't get to talk to me about what I can and can't offer," I spat, my voice dangerously low. "You think you're some knight in shining armor, coming to rescue her. You think this," I gestured wildly between them, at the intimacy in the air, "that I hadn't even realized had been building for months, is what she needed." Claire shot me a glare, and in that moment, it was clear. There was no love left in her eyes. There was nothing. "I didn't want it to be this way, Tim," she said, her voice cold, "but I'm done pretending. I'm done being with someone who doesn't even see me, who doesn't listen, doesn't care. I'm not sorry for being happy again." Happy? Those words stung like a slap across my face. "Happy? With him?" I asked, shaking my head in disbelief. "This is happiness, after everything we've built. Claire, after all the memories." Karl leaned forward, his voice suddenly sharp. "She's right. Tim, you weren't there. You checked out, and I stepped in. What did you expect?" I couldn't breathe. The anger and confusion were suffocating me. How could she do this? How could she let it come to this? I wanted to scream, to throw the table over, to force the truth out of them both, but all that came out was a strangled laugh. "I've been here, Karl," I said, through gritted teeth, my voice low but seething. "I've been working for us. I've been trying, but you've been creeping in, taking my place, and you think you deserve her." Karl didn't back down. He looked at me like I was the one who had lost control. "You've been here physically, but not emotionally, Tim. She needed someone who sees her, and I did." His eyes flickered briefly toward Claire, a look that made me feel like an intruder in my own life. "She's been waiting for you to wake up, but you never did." I turned to Claire, pleading now, my voice softer but filled with desperation. "Please, Claire, I didn't know. I was lost in work, but I'm here now. We can fix this. We can." But she cut me off, standing up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "It's too late, Tim," she said, her voice hard. "I fixed it. I moved on." She looked at Karl, then back at me, and I could see the finality in her gaze. "You're right, Tim. I don't need you anymore. Not like this." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel my heart breaking, each piece crumbling in slow motion. "You don't need me," I whispered, barely able to speak. "After everything we've been through, this is how it ends. You walk away, like it means nothing." Karl stood up then, stepping in front of Claire, his body blocking the view of her. "You need to get it through your head, Tim. This is over." His tone was sharp, final. "She's made her choice." The silence in the restaurant was suffocating, oppressive. I could feel the eyes of other patrons on us, but I didn't care. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears, the weight of the situation crashing down on me like a wave. Claire stepped closer to me then, her voice soft but carrying an edge of finality. "I'm not sorry, Tim. I can't go back to what we had. It was broken long before I found someone else to listen to me." For a moment, I just stood there, staring at her, my wife, the woman I thought I knew, and in that moment, I realized she had already left me a long time ago. "I loved you," I whispered, my voice breaking, but it was too late. She was already gone. Claire didn't say anything more. She just turned and walked away with Karl, leaving me standing there, alone in the wreckage of everything I thought I understood. Tim couldn't take his eyes off the scene before him. His body felt paralyzed, and his mind couldn't process what was happening. He stood in the doorway of the restaurant, and Claire and Karl Saturday at the table, laughing softly, exchanging jokes as if nothing had happened. She looked at him in a way he'd never seen before relaxed, happy, full of life. Tim felt his chest tighten with a mix of pain and rage. Clare, Tim's voice came out harsh and threatening. He took a step forward, and Karl glanced up, but he didn't flinch. He didn't look the least bit embarrassed. Instead, his gaze was full of confidence, even a hint of smugness. Clare quickly turned around, frowning, unsure of what to say. At first, there was confusion in her eyes, but it quickly shifted to something cold, almost indifferent. Karl, sensing her reaction, smirked and said, "Didn't expect this? What did you think? Everything would stay the same. You were the one who forgot her. Tim, you buried her under your work." Tim's face flushed with anger. He couldn't believe Karl was speaking to him so calmly, as if he were a stranger, not a husband. Tim took a step toward Karl, barely holding himself back. "You're sitting here, with my wife, in my spot, at my restaurant." Clare remained seated, silent, her eyes glistening, but she didn't stand. Karl took a sip from his wine glass, leaned back in his chair, and shrugged. "You've lost her already, Tim. She hasn't been yours for a long time. You were too busy to notice that she needed someone else. I was there, and she felt that, and I guess you're realizing that now." Clare finally spoke, her voice calm but devoid of regret. "I can't live in emptiness. Tim, you were too busy with your work. You didn't notice me, and Karl, he filled that gap. He gave me what you couldn't." Tim stood there, unsure of what to say. His heart felt like it was being crushed in his chest. He tried to understand how this had all happened, and 1,000 questions flashed in his mind, but she had already answered them. She had already made her choice. "You don't understand," Clare continued, her eyes never leaving Tim. "This isn't just a mistake. This is the result of your absence, your indifference. I couldn't live like that anymore." Karl laughed, his laughter full of superiority. "Yeah, Tim, it's not just a mistake. It's a decision, and it's Clare's decision." Tim felt his strength draining away. Everything he had tried to hold onto had crumbled in an instant, and now he stood in front of two people who were strangers to him. I can't believe this is happening," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Clare stood up, her face softening a little, but her eyes remained cold. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Tim. I don't want you to forgive me. It's already over." Tim silently turned around and walked out the door, not looking back. He knew they didn't expect him to come back. Everything he had known and loved was buried with that moment. The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of rage and betrayal. I couldn't shake the image of Clare and Karl together, their laughter, their intimacy, as if nothing had ever mattered between us. My mind was consumed with one thought: revenge. It wasn't enough to just be angry. I needed them to feel what I felt. I wanted to destroy the illusion they had built, expose them for what they truly were. I started following them. It began as casual observation, driving by their favorite spots, watching them in cafes, seeing the way Karl would pull Clare close, like she belonged to him now. It ate at me, but I wasn't ready to act yet. I needed to be strategic, to make sure I could hit them where it hurt the most. I began talking to our mutual friends. Little by little, I gathered pieces of information: where they went, who they met, when they were together. I learned that they were closer than I'd ever realized, that the lines between my wife and her lover had already blurred in ways I hadn't imagined. It made my blood boil, and it made me more determined to tear it all down. The thought of exposing them, of watching Karl crumble under the weight of his own lies, consumed me. I wasn't even sure I still wanted Clare, but I wanted her to feel the weight of the mistake she had made. I wanted her to understand that I was the one who had given her everything, and she had thrown it away. One evening, I had a moment of clarity. I could talk to Karl. I could meet him, pretend like I was ready to forgive, pretend like I was over everything. Maybe he'd slip, maybe he'd make a mistake, let something important slip that I could use to tear down his facade. I could make him reveal his true nature, and Clare would see it all. I sent him a text that evening: "Hey, want to grab a drink? We need to talk." I didn't mention Clare. I didn't want to make it obvious. Just the idea of him thinking that I was willing to be civil made me feel sick. But it was part of the plan. His reply came quickly: "Sure, I'll be at the usual place. See you soon." I drove to the bar, my hands trembling with anticipation. It felt like I was walking into enemy territory, but I was in control, or at least, I needed to act like I was. I walked in and found Karl sitting at a corner table, a beer in front of him. His eyes lit up when he saw me, and I could see the amusement in his gaze. He clearly didn't think much of me anymore. Tim, didn't expect to see you here, he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. I Saturday down across from him, keeping my posture calm, my expression cold. Yeah, well, I thought it was time we had a talk. Karl leaned back in his chair, taking a long sip from his beer. About what, Clare? I bit my tongue to keep the rage from spilling out. About everything, I said, keeping my tone casual, like this was just some normal conversation between two friends. He raised an eyebrow but didn't ask further questions. Instead, he studied me for a moment before smirking. I'm surprised, man. You really want to talk after everything that's happened? I leaned in closer, keeping my voice low but firm. I'm trying to understand, trying to make sense of how everything fell apart. I paused, then added, how you and Claire, how you got so close. Karl's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. It wasn't like that, Tim, he said, waving it off as if it were nothing. She was just lonely. You know, you were always busy with work, and she needed someone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was so simple to him, so dismissive. Lole, is that what she told you? I could feel the anger rising again. You think that's an excuse for what you did? Karl shrugged nonchalantly. I didn't force her into anything. She's a grown woman. I clenched my fists, the urge to lash out growing, but I needed him to keep talking, to slip up, as oh, what, you're just helping her through a rough patch. Is that it? He chuckled, his eyes glinting with amusement. Something like that. You know how it is. People need connection. It's not always about the big stuff. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Honestly, Tim, you should have paid more attention. She's been drifting for a while. That hit harder than I expected. He was right in some twisted way. I had been too wrapped up in my own world, too focused on work, to see the cracks forming in ours. But hearing him say it felt like salt in an open wound. I've been paying attention now, I said, my voice cold, and I'm wondering what exactly it is that makes you so special. Karl's eyes flickered for a second, and I saw the briefest moment of unease before he masked it with his usual bravado. I'm just me, Tim. I'm not the one who messed things up. That was it, the last line that I needed to hear. He was digging his own grave. I stood up suddenly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. You're not special, Karl. You're just the guy who came in when I wasn't looking, when I was too busy to notice, but now I see everything. I leaned in close, lowering my voice, and trust me, you're going to regret this. Karl's expression shifted, his confidence slipping for just a moment. You're crazy if you think this is over. Tim, it's not that simple. I didn't even respond. I turned and walked out of the bar, my heart racing. I had what I needed. It was time to make my move. The next steps were clear. Expose him, expose her, and make them both realize that they'd ruined everything. Tim Saturday in the car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind was a whirlwind, but one thing was clear. He could no longer just sit idly by. Claire had betrayed him. Karl, that cocky neighbor, had used her, and she had destroyed everything that had once been between them. When he walked into the house, Claire was there again. She Saturday on the couch, her gaze tired, as if she had been living in this house without emotion for an eternity. Karl wasn't there, but that no longer mattered. In his world, everything was broken. You know it's over, don't you? Tim said, trying to speak calmly, though his voice trembled with restrained fury. Claire looked at him, as if she couldn't understand what was happening. Are you really going to blame me for this? You were always busy. Tim, you forgot what it meant to love, to care, to be there. And then Karl was there when you didn't care. You think I didn't feel that I didn't want something more? Her words were like sharp jabs, and they hit their mark. Tim clenched his fists, but didn't respond. A thought began to swirl in his mind, the idea of revenge, of reclaiming even a little of his dignity. But what could he do? You don't deserve pity, she whispered, looking at him like he was a stranger. You were my husband, but you were my friend. You never understood what I needed. In his head, the thought of Karl flashed for a moment. If he was the one who made Claire happy, then what was stopping Tim from being that way too? But there was no room for those thoughts. His heart was breaking from the pain and the realization that maybe it all didn't matter anymore. You've already made your choice, Claire, Tim said, his voice becoming firm. So why continue this charade? If you want to be with him, go to him. You've already lost me. She stood up, her eyes filled with bitterness. You weren't the person I was waiting for, and maybe if you had been, maybe I wouldn't have gone to Karl. But now it's too late. Tim. Her words hit him like a blow, and he felt everything inside him fall apart. He knew he couldn't win her back, but the desire for revenge burned within him. "You don't deserve this, Claire, and you don't deserve happiness with him," he whispered, his face twisting with pain and anger. Claire turned away without answering, her face unreadable. Tim turned and walked out, not waiting for her response. He knew it was over, but maybe, just maybe, this was the end of one life, and the beginning of a new one. Ideas for how to regain control, how to reclaim something he had lost, started spinning in his mind. Tim spent the next few days in a haze, struggling to make sense of everything. His emotions were all over the place in her. Resentment, confusion. He couldn't quite believe what had happened. Claire had betrayed him in the worst way, and Karl had wormed his way into their lives, turning everything upside down. He found himself looking at the messages Claire had sent him in the past, remembering the moments when they were happy, when their love felt strong. How could everything have unraveled so quickly? But deep down, Tim knew that he wasn't entirely blameless. He had been distant, too consumed with his own life to see what was slipping through his fingers. And Claire, she had given up, looking for something that he couldn't provide. It was in the middle of the night when Tim's phone buzzed, breaking through the silence of his thoughts. It was an unknown number. He hesitated but answered. "Tim." The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper. "Karl." Tim's voice was steady, but inside he was seething. "Listen, I know you hate me right now. I get it, but I'm not calling to fight. Claire, she's not the same anymore. She's gone. Tim, she's not the woman you loved." Karl's voice held a strange tone, one that Tim couldn't quite decipher. Was he genuinely trying to help, or was he just rubbing salt in the wound? Tim took a deep breath. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying that I'm not the one who broke her. You did. You were too late, too distant. I'm not asking you to forgive me, but I need you to understand something. She's made her choice, and honestly, I think you know it too." The words hit harder than Tim had expected. They weren't angry, they weren't even mocking. It was almost like Karl was offering a warning. "I don't need your advice, Karl. I don't need anything from you." Tim spat, his voice tightening with fury. "You took what was mine. You don't get to tell me what to do." Karl's voice became quieter. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you that the woman you loved is gone, and if you want to hold on to her, you're just going to destroy yourself. I'm giving you a chance to walk away before it's too late." Tim slammed the phone down, his heart pounding. It was one thing to hear it from Claire, but from Karl, someone who had no right to speak to him like that. It's done in a different way. But the truth of Karl's words lingered in the air, and Tim couldn't shake the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, Karl was right. Later that evening, Tim made a decision. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about getting back at Karl or Claire. It was about moving forward, about reclaiming himself, even if that meant letting go of the past. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to fight for someone who had already left him, but he would find a way to heal, for himself. The days that followed were a blur for Tim. He couldn't stop thinking about Karl's words, the way they had rung in his head, long after the conversation ended. He tried to push them aside, to focus on something, anything that would help him move on. But it wasn't easy. The apartment, once a place of shared memories, now felt suffocating. Every corner, every item in it reminded him of the life he used to have. Tim avoided Claire as much as he could. He knew she was still there, but something had changed. Their interactions were cold, distant. She didn't even try to explain herself anymore. Tim didn't know if it hurt more than her betrayal, or if it was the realization that she had truly moved on, leaving him in the past. One night, Tim decided to go out for a walk. He needed air, needed a break from the suffocating weight of his thoughts. It was around midnight when he found himself standing outside the bar where he and Claire had shared one of their first dates. A place that once felt familiar now seemed like a distant memory. As he stood there, lost in thought, someone tapped him on the shoulder. He turned around, and there was Karl, standing there, looking almost casual, as if they were old friends. "Do you always stalk me, or is this a new hobby?" Tim's voice was low, angry, but there was a hint of something else, something more resigned. He was tired of fighting. Karl raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond to the provocation. "I just wanted to talk. You don't have to say anything, but you deserve to hear this from me, not from anyone else." Tim's heart raced. He wasn't sure what Karl could possibly have left to say, but he knew he wasn't ready to hear it. "You don't know me anything." Karl smiled faintly, but there was no malice in his eyes. "Maybe not, but Claire, she's not who you think she is, and she's not the person you remember either." Tim clenched his fists. I'm done with both of you." "Maybe you should be," Karl said softly. but I'm just trying to warn you. You're clinging to something that's already gone, and if you want to heal, you need to let go. The words hit Tim harder than he wanted to admit. He didn't want to hear this, didn't want to face the truth, but it was there, staring him in the face. Claire had moved on, and no amount of anger or bitterness could change that. For a long moment, Tim said nothing. The silence between them was heavy, filled with everything they both had failed to say. Finally, Tim spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you have to do it, Karl? Why her?" Karl paused, a faint sigh escaping his lips. "Because she was lonely, Tim. She was looking for something that you stopped giving her. I didn't ask for this. I never planned for it to happen. But when someone is lost, they'll find something to hold on to." Tim's chest tightened. The truth stung, but it was the truth. "And now you have her, don't you?" Karl didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply nodded. "Yeah, I do. But I'm not here to rub it in your face. I'm here because I think you deserve to know that it wasn't about me taking anything from you. It was about Claire needing something you couldn't give her anymore." Tim felt a cold wave of emptiness wash over him. Everything he had tried to save had crumbled. He had spent so much time focusing on the wrong things: anger, the betrayal, the need for revenge, that he hadn't realized the most painful part. Claire had already left him long before Karl had stepped in. "I'll figure this out," Tim muttered, turning away. "I need to be alone." Karl didn't stop him, didn't try to convince him otherwise. He simply watched as Tim walked away, disappearing into the night. The words hung in the air between them, unspoken, unresolved. Tim didn't know what he was going to do next, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep holding on to a life that was already over. It was time to let go. The following days were a blur of emotion for Tim. His mind raced, replaying everything's argument, Karl's words, Claire's absence. The apartment that had once felt like home now felt like a cage. There were no more conversations, no more laughter, just silence, the quiet weight of what had been lost. Claire had started coming home late. She didn't offer any explanations, and Tim didn't ask. He had stopped expecting anything from her. Her betrayal had torn the last shred of trust between them. He wondered if she even noticed his growing distance, or if she was simply too wrapped up in her own world to care. One evening, as Tim sat at the kitchen table, staring into the empty coffee mug in front of him, the door opened. Claire stepped inside, her eyes immediately meeting his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. "I need to talk to you," Claire said, her voice quiet but firm. Tim's gaze hardened. "I don't think there's anything left to say." Claire's face tightened. "You don't even care anymore, do you, about anything?" "I care," Tim replied, his voice tight with frustration. "I care that everything we had is gone. I care that you've been with him behind my back when I gave you everything. I care that you don't even seem to notice that I'm still here, trying to make sense of all of this." Claire looked away, as though the weight of his words was too much to bear. "I'm sorry, Tim. I never meant for any of this to happen." "But you," she hesitated, her voice shaking. "You stopped seeing me. You stopped being there for me when I needed you, and I couldn't keep waiting for you to change." Tim stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "So you thought betraying me was the answer? What do you want from me now, Claire? An apology for not being enough?" Claire's eyes filled with tears. "No, I don't expect an apology. I just need you to understand. I'm not proud of what I did, but I was lost. And when Karl came along, he made me feel seen. He made me feel something I hadn't felt in so long." Tim's heart twisted, the weight of her confession crashing over him. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the realization that he had let her feel so invisible for so long. He had been so wrapped up in his own world, in his work, in everything else, that he had failed to see the cracks forming in their relationship. "I don't know how to fix this, Claire," Tim said quietly, his voice cracking. "I don't know if I can." Claire took a hesitant step forward, her hands trembling. "I don't think we can fix it, Tim, not anymore." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had known, deep down, that this was coming, but hearing her say it out loud, made it all too real. He had lost her, not just to Karl, but to the distance he had allowed to grow between them. They stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of their broken marriage hanging between them. Finally, Tim spoke, his voice low but steady. "I don't want to fight anymore, Claire. I don't want to keep holding on to something that's already gone." Claire nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Neither do I, but I'm sorry, Tim. I'm so sorry." Tim didn't know what to say. There was nothing left to say. They had reached the end of the road, and now, They had to face the consequences of their choices. As Claire walked past him, heading for the door, Tim didn't stop her. He didn't know if he should. There was no reason to. It was over. When the door clicked shut behind her, Tim collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands, the weight of everything, betrayal, the loss, the guilt pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. He didn't know how to move forward, but one thing was certain, he couldn't go back. Tim spent the following days in a haze. The apartment that had once been filled with the sounds of their laughter, their quiet conversations, now felt like a hollow shell. The silence was deafening. He had tried to keep busy work, errands, anything to distract him from the overwhelming ache in his chest, but nothing worked. Every corner of the apartment seemed to echo with the memories of what they had been. Claire had left for good. She had moved in with Karl, and the realization settled heavily in Tim's bones. There were no more late-night discussions, no more touches, no more familiarity, just the empty space where they used to exist together. It was a Saturday afternoon when the knock came. Tim didn't expect anyone, not anymore. He opened the door to find a man standing on the other side. His appearance was disheveled and shaven, wearing a jacket that looked like it had seen better days. The man's eyes were dark, intense. "I need to talk to you," the stranger said, his voice rough. Tim's heart raced, his instincts telling him to shut the door, but something in the man's presence made him hesitate. "Who are you?" Tim asked, his tone guarded. The man sighed, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I'm Michael, Claire's brother." Tim's breath caught in his throat. He had known Claire had a brother, but then again, they had grown apart long before he had the chance to learn everything about her. "Claire and we've had some issues," Michael continued, his voice filled with regret. "And I know things between you two have gotten complicated, but I think you need to hear this." Tim narrowed his eyes. "What's this about?" Michael hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he shoved a piece of paper into Tim's hand. "This is a letter from Claire. She left it for you. She wanted me to give it to you, but I think it's time you read it." Tim glanced at the envelope in his hand. The familiar handwriting on the front sent a cold wave of memories rushing over him. Without another word, he stepped back, motioning for Michael to come in. They Saturday in the living room, the air thick with tension. Tim ripped open the envelope and pulled out the letter. He began reading, his hands shaking as he read Claire's words. "Tim, I never wanted things to end this way. I didn't expect to hurt you like I did, but I can't live in a lie anymore. I don't know if I ever truly loved you the way I should have, but I do know that you deserve more than what I could give. I'm sorry for everything, for betraying you, for being selfish, for not seeing how much you needed me, but I also know that you have to let me go. You have to let me find my own way, just as you need to find yours." Tim's throat tightened, and he struggled to swallow. There it was, finality of it all. The words he had feared, the ones that had haunted him in his dreams, now laid out before him. Claire had made her choice. She had already moved on, and she was telling him, in the harshest way possible, that it was over. Michael watched him silently, his expression unreadable. Tim put the letter down, his hands trembling. "So, that's it then?" Tim's voice cracked. "She's gone." Michael nodded slowly. "She is trying to rebuild her life. I don't know where it's going, but I know that she's serious about Karl. She's made her peace with it." Tim's mind raced, the anger and betrayal bubbling up once again. "And what about me? What am I supposed to do now?" Michael sighed, his face softening with empathy. "I don't know, Tim, but I do know that you can't keep living like this. You have to move forward, for yourself. Holding on to something that's already gone won't bring her back. I'm sorry." Tim stood up abruptly, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. "Thanks for the letter," he muttered, his voice cold. Michael didn't respond. He simply stood up, his eyes briefly meeting Tim's before he turned to leave. As they stepped out the door, Tim watched him go. The room was silent once again. Tim's heart ached with the finality of it all. Claire was gone, and there was no turning back. The love he had fought for, the relationship he had tried to hold together, had slipped through his fingers. But now, with the door closed and the final word spoken, Tim knew that it was time to face the truth. He had to start over. He had to rebuild his life, piece by piece, from the ashes of what had been. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. Tim's days blurred together after Claire's departure. The apartment felt like a prison place where memories suffocated him at every turn. He had thrown himself into work, burying himself in the noise of meetings, reports, and deadlines. But no matter how much he tried to escape, the weight of his reality lingered. One evening, after another long day, Tim returned home to an empty apartment. The silence hit him like a cold gust of wind. He had stopped looking at the clock. It didn't matter anymore. The time was irrelevant. What mattered was that he was still here, still dealing with the aftermath of everything that had gone wrong. He kicked off his shoes and collapsed onto the couch. His phone buzzed. A message from his colleague. "Olivia, how's everything going? We should grab coffee sometime. You okay?" He stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. Olivia had been a friend for years, but lately, her concern had seemed more insistent. He appreciated her check-ins, but it only reminded him of what he had lost, how much he had retreated into himself. He set the phone aside, rubbing his face in exhaustion. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Tim frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? He stood up slowly, and when he opened the door, he was taken aback to see Karl standing there. "What the hell do you want?" Tim's voice was cold, laced with anger. He had been dreading this moment, but now that it was here, he couldn't mask the fury that had been building inside him for weeks. Karl raised his hands in a gesture of peace, his expression unreadable. "Look, I know this isn't what you want, but we need to talk." Tim's eyes narrowed. "Talk about what? You and Claire? You've already destroyed everything. What more is there to say?" Karl sighed, his posture tense but controlled. "It's not about Claire. It's about you, Tim." Tim scoffed. "Me? Why the hell would you care about me? After everything that's happened, you come here to what? Play the hero? Spare me." "I'm not here to play the hero. I'm here because I think you're hurting, and I can see it," Karl replied, his voice steady but with a hint of compassion that caught him off guard. "And I think you need to hear something you've been avoiding." Tim stepped back, disbelief washing over him. "What the hell are you talking about?" Karl looked at Tim with something close to empathy, but there was also an underlying tension in his gaze. "Claire's not the only one who made mistakes. You did too. She told me everything. Tim, everything. And I think you need to hear it, because I think you're blaming her for a lot more than you should be." Tim's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to slam the door in Karl's face, but something about the way Karl spoke made him hesitate. He stepped back from the door, his anger simmering but giving way to a strange curiosity. "Fine, come in," Tim said, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. Karl stepped inside, looking around the apartment as if measuring its emptiness. He then sat her down on the couch, without waiting for an invitation. "Claire left because she couldn't do it anymore," Karl said bluntly, cutting through the silence. "She was suffocating. Tim, you were so lost in your own world, so focused on everything but her. She loved you, but she couldn't keep pretending that things were okay when you were never there." Tim clenched his fists. "That's bullshit. I worked for us. I did everything I could to keep things together." Karl shook his head. "You weren't there emotionally, and that's what killed everything. Claire needed more than just a partner. She needed someone who would listen, who would be there when it counted. You were so consumed by your career, so obsessed with fixing everything by doing more, that you didn't even notice her slipping away." Tim felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "You're just trying to justify what you did. You think that coming here, saying all this crap, is going to make me feel better? I know what happened. I know she left me for you." Karl's expression softened. "No, it's not about me. It's about you understanding that you weren't the only one who lost something in this. She didn't leave because she didn't love you. She left because you weren't present. And now, maybe you're starting to see that, but blaming her won't fix it." Tim stood up abruptly, his chest tightening with the weight of Karl's words. His emotions were a whirlwind danger, betrayal, guilt, everything mixing together until they couldn't make sense of it anymore. "Get out," Tim said through gritted teeth, his voice shaking. Karl didn't argue. He stood up, his gaze lingering on Tim for a moment before he turned toward the door. "Think about it, Tim. You have to face the truth if you ever want to move forward," Karl said quietly before stepping out, leaving Tim alone with the turmoil inside him. The door clicked shut, and Tim was left standing in the silence once again. This time, though, the silence felt different. It was not just the absence of Claire, but the weight of everything he had been too blind to see. Tim couldn't shake Karl's words. They echoed in his mind like a constant hum, filling the empty spaces where silence used to be. He had spent so much time thinking about what had gone wrong, blaming Claire, blaming himself, that he had never stopped to truly understand the bigger picture. But Karl's visit had opened something in him, something raw, painful, but necessary. Days passed, and the apartment felt more like a shell. Tim had always been a man of action, A man who solved problems. But this was something he couldn't fix with a spreadsheet or a meeting. This was about something much deeper, something he wasn't sure how to face. He found himself staring at his phone more often than he'd like to admit. He had avoided calling Claire, avoiding any contact at all, but that urge to reach out, to fix things, became overwhelming. Maybe it was too late. Maybe she had moved on, just as he had feared, but part of him hoped that there was still a chance some way to repair the damage it had done. One afternoon, Tim found himself in a familiar cafe, a place where he and Claire had spent countless mornings together, sipping coffee and talking about nothing in particular. A memory hit him like a wave, and he Saturday down at the same table, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the empty seat across from him. A part of him wanted to call her, to apologize, to beg for another chance, but another part, a quieter part, told him that he had to face the consequences of his neglect, no matter how much it hurt. As if on cue, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Olivia. "Tim, I think you need to talk to Claire. I know you're hurting, but holding on to all this anger isn't going to help you." Tim stared at the message, feeling the weight of it settle into his chest. Olivia had been there for him during the worst of it, offering support without judgment, but even her words couldn't shake the feeling that he had already lost everything. He put his phone down and took a deep breath. The decision wasn't easy, but it was time. He stood up, walking toward the door, unsure of what he would say, but knowing that he couldn't live with this unresolved pain any longer. The walk to Claire's apartment felt like it took an eternity. His mind raced with every possible scenario, every way the conversation could go. But in the end, he knew it didn't matter. He had to try. He had to at least give it a shot. When he arrived, he hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. The seconds felt like hours, and then the door creaked open. Claire stood there, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him. "Tim," her voice was cautious, as if she didn't know what to expect. Tim swallowed hard. "Claire, we need to talk." Claire looked away for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what you think we can say." "Tim, no." Tim cut her off, his voice trembling but firm. "I don't care what happened between us. I don't care about what we've lost. I just need to say that I was wrong. I was so caught up in my own world that I didn't see what was happening. I didn't see you slipping away." Claire's eyes softened, but there was a sadness in them that cut Tim to the core. "You were never present, Tim, not like I needed you to be. I couldn't keep pretending." Tim felt his chest tighten with the weight of her words, but he pushed through. "I know, I wasn't there for you, and I ruined everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I understand now. I see what I did, and I'm sorry. Claire, I'm so sorry." Claire looked down, her lips trembling as she processed his words. For a moment, there was only silence between them. "I don't know what to say, Tim," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Tim took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "You don't have to say anything. I just need you to know that I understand. I see everything now." Claire closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there was a tear at the corner of her eye. "I don't know if we can fix this," she murmured. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Tim nodded, his throat tight. "I don't know either, but I had to try." For a long moment, they stood there, the tension between them thick, neither of them knowing what would come next. And though the pain was still there, lingering like an open wound, Tim realized that this conversation, this small step, was the first real thing he'd done to try and make things right. The days following that conversation were an uncomfortable blur. Tim had hoped that Claire would soften, that she would see his remorse and agree to rebuild what they had. But as the days passed, he began to realize that he was not the only one who had changed. Claire remained distant, almost as though she had already made up her mind about what her life would be without him. She stopped sharing small details about her day, stopped asking about his work, and stopped making the small gestures that used to keep their connection alive. It was as if she had emotionally packed her bags long before Tim had even realized she was leaving. One evening, after yet another day of strained silence, Tim tried one more time. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his phone, when Claire walked in, her steps slow but deliberate. Her eyes didn't meet his. "I'm going to see Karl tonight," she said, as though she were casually mentioning a trip to the store. Tim's heart stopped. This was it. This was the moment he had feared. All his attempts to fix things, to save them, were leading him right to this final blow, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "Are you serious? After everything?" Claire didn't flinch. She shrugged, like it wasn't a big deal. It's just a drink. You wouldn't understand. The words stung more than he expected, but it didn't give in to his anger. Not yet. Claire, you can't keep doing this. You're still my wife. His voice cracked slightly. Do you even care? Her eyes finally met his. There was no regret, no sorrow in them, only something distant, cold. I'm sorry, Tim, but I've already made my choice. I can't keep pretending. The words hung in the air like a sentence. Tim felt a sinking weight in his chest, his world collapsing again. He was losing her, but worse than that, she seemed to have already let go. Don't, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Please, don't go. She turned toward the door, and Tim watched her leave, the finality of it all hitting him like a physical blow. It was over. As the door closed behind her, Tim collapsed in the chair, the weight of her departure sinking in. He had hoped for a miracle, but in the end, he knew that there was nothing left to save. The night dragged on in the empty apartment, and Tim felt the echo of the silence weigh on him. He sat there motionless, staring at the door where Clare had just walked out. He had hoped, desperately, for a sign that she would turn around, that the bond they once shared could pull her back to him. But it was clear now, she had already severed whatever thread still connected them. Minutes turned into hours, and the apartment felt colder, emptier. The reality of what had happened started to sink in. Clare was gone, but it wasn't just her physical absence. It was the emotional gulf between them, the space she had created long before she'd walked out that night. Tim knew he had made mistakes. He knew he had neglected her in ways that no apology could undo. But what hit him hardest was how easily she had walked away. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was the final confirmation that the love they once shared had faded beyond recognition. As the evening wore on, he found himself pacing the apartment, unable to sit still. He had never felt this lost, this alone. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Karl. Claire's with me. I'll make sure she's okay. She just needs time to think. I know this is hard for you, Tim, but she's made her decision, and you need to respect it. The words struck him like a slap to the face. Karl, of all people, had become the one to offer comfort, to take his place. Tim could feel his anger rising, his chest tightening as he thought about how his life had been taken from him so effortlessly, how his wife had chosen someone else, and how Karl had moved into the space Tim had left vacant. His fingers hovered over the phone screen, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge, of confronting Karl, of forcing some kind of closure. But deep down, he knew it would do no good. Clare had already made her choice. The door was closed, and there was no way back. Minutes later, he found himself in his car, driving aimlessly through the streets. He needed to get away. He needed space to think. His mind was a whirlwind of rage, confusion, and the bitter sting of betrayal. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he couldn't stay in the apartment. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. He found himself at the park, sitting on a bench, staring blankly at the empty swings. The quietness of the night contrasted sharply with the chaos in his mind. He had been here before, sitting on this very bench, planning a future with Clare. They had talked about their dreams, their hopes, their life together. But now, all of that seemed meaningless, gone. His phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a call from Clare. He stared at the screen for a moment before answering. His voice was rough, but he forced himself to speak. Clare, he said, trying to keep his emotions in check. Tim, her voice was strained, as if she wasn't sure what to say. I don't know what you want from me. I want you back, he said before he could stop himself, the desperation in his voice betraying him. She was silent for a long moment. I don't know if I can do that anymore. Tim, I've changed, and I think you have too. Her words were like a knife to his heart. He had hoped for a chance, for her to admit that she still cared, but instead, she was telling him that they had drifted so far apart that there was no way back. I love you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know, she replied, her voice cracking, but I'm not in love with you anymore. I'm sorry, Tim, I really am, but we're both stuck in the past, and we need to move on. The words hung in the air, final and unyielding. Tim sat there in stunned silence, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew it was over, but hearing it from her, hearing her say it so plainly, broke something inside of him. With one final sigh, she hung up. Tim stared at the phone for a long time, feeling the cold emptiness inside him spread, consuming everything. He had lost her, and this time, there would be no coming back. Tim sat there motionless in the park, the phone still clutched tightly in his hand. The cool night air was a stark contrast to the warmth he once felt in Clare's presence. The sound of distant traffic and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind did nothing to ease the overwhelming sense of emptiness that had taken over him. Every breath felt heavier, and the weight of his loss pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. He hadn't expected her to call. He hadn't expected any of this. Even after everything that had happened, he still held on to some fragile hope, some naive belief that they could fix things, that love would somehow be enough to bridge the distance that had grown between them. But it wasn't enough. Claire had made her choice, and in the process, she had shattered the world they had built together. And now, there was nothing left. The phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Claire. It was a message from Karl. "I know this is hard, Tim, but please understand Claire needs time. She's hurt. We're all hurting, but she's made a decision. I don't want to be the one to do this to you, but she's with me now." Tim read the message over and over, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every word felt like a new layer of salt in a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. He wanted to lash out, to scream at Karl, to demand answers, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring Claire back. He had already lost her. The finality of it had begun to sink in. But that didn't stop the anger from building inside him, a sharp, bitter fire that burned every thought. Tim stood up abruptly, pacing the sidewalk, trying to make sense of everything. He had tried. He had put in the work, or at least he had thought he had. He had given her space when she needed it, focused on his job, kept his distance, thinking that maybe if he did enough, maybe if he showed enough patience, she would come back to him. But now he saw how wrong he had been. How wrong they both had been. What they had built wasn't enough anymore, and he had let it slip through his fingers. Maybe they had both lost sight of what mattered. Maybe it wasn't just Claire. Maybe it was him too. But still, the anger clawed at him, tearing away at any trace of rationality. He wanted closure, wanted to confront her, to confront Karl, to understand what had happened. He wanted to scream at them both for destroying everything he had loved. He walked back to his car, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence around him. He got inside, slamming the door shut, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The drive back to his apartment was a blur, his mind racing with thoughts of how everything had fallen apart. But as he neared his building, something in him frowned. He didn't want to go back inside. Inside, there were too many memories of Claire, too many ghosts. The apartment had once been their haven, their shared space of warmth and love. Now it was just a reminder of what he had lost. He parked the car a block away and sat there for a while, staring out at the empty streets. He felt like a stranger in his own life. There was no one left to share it with, no one to turn to. Tim knew that, no matter how much he tried to understand it, there was no escaping the reality of what had happened. He had lost her, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of his life, alone. For the first time in a long time, Tim realized that there was no way back. The damage was done. The person he had been, the life they had built together, was gone, and in its place was nothing but a broken man staring into the abyss of his own regrets. And he didn't know how to move forward from here. Thanks for watching till the end.